Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you all for joining us for session 2 of the US-Australia Indo-Pacific Conversation Series. This session is focusing on strengthening regional defense and deterrence and is held with support from the US Embassy Canberra and the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. We would like to give the floor to today's moderator, David Santoro, Vice President at Pacific Forum, to kick off today's program. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Ariel. Aloha, everyone. My name is David Santoro. As Ariel mentioned, I am Vice President of Pacific Forum, and I direct the nuclear policy programs at the Forum. Welcome to the second session of the US-Australia Indo-Pacific Conversation Series, our virtual dialogue series organized in partnership with the US Studies Center at the University of Sydney. This is an initiative that receives the generous support of the US Department of State through the US Embassy in Canberra. We kicked off this series last month with a session featuring Ambassador Jane Hardy, who's Chief of Mission at the Australian Consulate General here in Honolulu, and Dr. Michael Goldman, who's Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Canberra. Both noted that they noted the enduring strength of the US-Australia alliance, which was founded in shared liberal democratic values and which has flourished beyond the front lines to include cooperation in many areas, including trade, education, international development, and health. Now, I think it's undeniable that the alliance has proven its worth over the last decade, as the United States has pursued deeper ties with the Indo-Pacific. While standing for the rule of law as well as free and open democratic societies will be enduring priorities for the alliance, multilateral cooperation with allies and partners will also be critical to address, in particular, two prominent, wicked and very immediate problems: the pandemic and the adverse effects of climate change. But the alliance is also actively working to address malign actors and security challenges across several domains. And today's session on strengthening regional deterrence and defense will reflect on the nature of the United States and Australia's security partnership. So we will really zoom in on what alliances are fundamentally about, or at least what I think they are at root, which is about mutual defense and, yes, deterrence. And so with that, we are joined today by two first-rate scholars, Madison Estes, who's an associate research analyst at CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis, and Ashley Townsend, who's director of foreign policy and defense studies at the US Studies Center at the University of Sydney. So just a little bit about our speakers. At CNA, Madison works for the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. Her expertise is nuclear weapons and arms control, and her research portfolio includes deterrence, extended deterrence, escalation, strategic stability, ballistic missile defense, and, as I said, arms control. So all the good stuff. Prior to CNA, she worked at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, as well as the US Embassy in London. And she was also a member of the 2019 CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues, Nuclear Scholars Initiative. So welcome, Madison. Joining Madison is Ashley. At the US Studies Center, Ashley works on international security and strategic affairs with a focus on the Indo-Pacific. And his portfolio is equally vast, ranging from Australia, China, US alliances, and of course, defense issues. Previously, he held research and teaching positions in the Alliance 21 programs at the center and others at the Lowy Institute, the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, the Center for Asia-Pacific Cooperation and Governance at Fudan University in China, as well as many other organizations. The list is long. Because the focus of this session is deterrence, I just want to use the prerogative of the chair to let everyone know that Ashley and I are the co-chairs of an important dialogue process, the Track 1.5 US-Australia Indo-Pacific Deterrence Dialogue, which is an invitation-only dialogue that has run since 2018 And it focuses not only on how to strengthen the alliance in this domain, but also how to use the alliance in a way that has collective deterrence and defense effect in the region. What you see on your screen, or what you will soon see, actually there's a link in the chat room, is the latest report, Operationalizing Deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, which is available online. And in fact, a shorter version of it was published by the Indo-Pacific Command just yesterday in their journal called the Indo-Pacific Defense Forum. So it is also available there if you're interested. Now, before I turn over the floor to our speakers, just a few quick disclaimers. The views expressed by the speakers and myself as moderator do not necessarily reflect the views and official positions of the US Department of State, the US Embassy in Canberra, or the US government writ large. All views and opinions expressed in these webinars also do not necessarily reflect the positions of Pacific Forum or of the speaker's home institutions. Finally, all remarks, including those made after the presentations, are on the record, and they will be shared on Pacific Forum's YouTube channel after the session. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to our first speaker, Madison. Madison, please keep your remark within the 8-minute limit, if you don't mind. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, David. And thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Pacific Forum for inviting me to speak to you all tonight. So I was asked to focus my remarks really on US deterrent strategy writ large in the Indo-Pacific. And so I thought it'd be best to really kick things off with kind of a broad introduction to US deterrence challenges, and then narrow it down a little bit from there. So to start, I think it goes probably without saying in this audience that the US has several challenges for crafting deterrent strategies. The chief one being that there are multiple powers that the United States seeks to deter all at the same time. Russia, China, as well as North Korea. And when it comes to nuclear issues, as well as some conventional issues as well. And then within the Indo-Pacific, the United States confronts very different aggressors in China and then North Korea. And so thinking about this, the United States has to deal with both deterring these two actors that are quite different from each other and have different objectives and goals, while also still keeping a force posture and an overall deterrent strategy that it can implement as a whole across the whole government, that is able to counter its one of its strongest competitors, particularly from a nuclear deterrent standpoint, which, as mentioned in my bio earlier, is really my specialty. To counter its strongest competitor in this field is Russia. So how the new Biden administration in the United States shapes its deterrent strategies, particularly in the realm of nuclear deterrence over the course of the next 4 years, is still to be determined. I think we can expect a couple things that we can see through reporting and statements of US officials that are in their positions. And one of those things is that I do think we can expect that China is going to remain a priority, and that much of the great power competition dynamics will probably remain in place. So thinking about this, I'll probably spend the rest of my remarks, rather than trying to read the tea leaves on what the future of US deterrence is going to be, I'll give you instead maybe some food for thought of key areas that I see as being important to watch and think on and develop a deeper understanding about as the United States is thinking about how it's going to compete and deter in the Indo-Pacific region. And I will say that these are really, these issues are really focused on China in particular, although of course, if we'd like to discuss more thinking about North Korea in the Q&A or the discussion, I'm happy to do that. So the US seems to, when it comes to China, be feeling the most pressure to successfully deter China conventionally. But at the same time, they're also keeping a pretty watchful and wary eye on China's growing nuclear stockpile and its diversifying and increasingly more flexible nuclear arsenal. So the first thing that I would say we need to pay attention to is we need to start paying attention to the decision calculus of both China and the United States, and understanding how each country's views on deterrence and escalation align and then don't align. I think this is important because the US and China, from what I can see from research I've done at CNA and from discussions with my CNA colleagues who really specialize in the Indo-Pacific region, both of these countries view these acts of aggressions across the spectrum very differently. And they see the actual crossing or potential crossing of the nuclear threshold very differently as well. This really manifests itself in, China having a no first use policy versus the US and it having some theories of victory for war, that including potentially nuclear war. That approach by the US is motivated by several things, as I kind of alluded to earlier. But all this to say that Chinese perceptions really do seem to differ in this regard when it comes to potential nuclear use or the threat of nuclear use. Essentially, from my understanding, is that China sees any sort of nuclear use would essentially lead to full-out nuclear war, this is very different than some of the other competitors the United States has. And so this is, I think, a challenge and something that we're going to have to grapple with and understand a little bit more and understand these nuances. Simultaneously, the second thing I would point out is that while we've got these very differing views on deterrence and escalation and how it happens and works in practice, simultaneously, China does not seem to, I think, accept or understand how the US views its strategies for blunting US capabilities, and does not seem to maybe understand how destabilizing they could potentially be. China really, because China maintains no first use policy, I can understand why there would be kind of a burden of action, right, at these lower levels of conflict. There's really a lot more pressure to succeed in a lot of ways to be able to terminate war if you're trying to avoid using your full scale potential force, right? However, I think some of these strategies for blunting, blinding, or debilitating US capabilities, particularly those that have underpinnings to both the US conventional and nuclear deterrence and operations, while they might maximize Chinese abilities to terminate war on their terms that don't push to nuclear use, at the same time, they don't seem to account for risk that they may be accruing that could push the United States to consider a nuclear response. Now, I will say this, I don't think the US wants that to be their first course of action. And there are strong normative reasons why the US wouldn't deliberately use nuclear weapons. But I think China's calculating that and thinks that the United States might not consider this as a possibility unless it's in the case of total all-out war. But I think in crisis and conflicts, we shouldn't discount the risk of inadvertent escalation that might come up and supersede these norms or change the landscape of US interest. And so that's the second thing I would point out. Basically, the maximization of lower level aggressions plus the actions surrounding the expansion of its nuclear deterrence, I think, the expansion of China's nuclear deterrent has been fueling insecurities of the United States and is causing some doubt in this no first use pledge. That's the second thing I keep my eye on. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. So the last thing I will point out is that because of these potential misperceptions and these diverging views, this is, I would argue, also a very critical opportunity for the US to really lean on what it really has a historical track of doing, which is picking up a two-pronged approach of both bolstering deterrence against a competitor while also seeking constructive opportunities to enhance stability with that competitor, and particularly through the use of nuclear arms control and nuclear risk reduction efforts. I think from what I can see, it seems that Beijing is actually ripe in some ways for pursuing such actions because overall they are more risk averse. But the U.S. needs to accept the burden that then it's going to have to really work to convey this risk in order to send that message and make them want to minimize the risk. However, I think we need to be cautious about essentially trying to run before we can walk in this area, and attempting to multilateralize any such efforts through either arms control or even just nuclear risk reduction with other countries such as Russia or the UK or France. The intent is good behind these things, but I do worry that any attempts to do so quickly might scare off China. And all this at the same time, taken together, allies have an important role. Allies like Australia have an important role throughout all of these different considerations and things to focus on, and both in the deterrence and dialogue pieces of this. And really, I think one thing that we could do for the alliance is to continue to just build a shared understanding of what US and Australia deterrence objectives and priorities are in the region, in order to then work together to build a strong and united front that we communicate to those competitors. So I will close with that and pass it over to Ashley and David. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison. Ashley, over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Madison, for those great comments. I think that really got us off to a good start. I'm going to be responding really somewhat in a mirror image from an Australian perspective, and then focusing in on the conventional military domain of the equation, whereas you gave us a really good account of the nuclear domain. Before I do either of those things, I thought it would be useful to just maybe set the scene a little bit from my perspective, and speaking personally here. But I think that a point of departure for a conversation about the role of the alliance in an evolving Indo-Pacific is bluntly to assess that the United States can no longer uphold a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific by itself. So it's a reality that's now being well recognized at the senior most levels of US government, that lay behind the 2018 National Defense Strategy, that seems to me to lie behind some of the thinking of key personnel in the incoming Biden administration. And beyond that, that galvanizes a policy argument, or at least an alliance transformation argument, that essentially looks to multilateralize, collectivize, coalitionize, or federate, use your word of choice, Australia, United States, Japanese, and other regional partners into a more coordinated set of efforts to approach the problem of the changing conventional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. That to me seems to be really where this conversation begins, and it's both a challenge and an opportunity for alliances in the region. It's a challenge because what's driving this is a combination of China's sustained and increasingly effective investments in anti-access area denial systems, but more broadly, its military rise, transformation, modernization, and force structure increases, which over time, and this has been a trend that we've witnessed really since the 1990s, has been increasingly problematizing the regional security environment from an operational standpoint, to the extent that today, large parts of the Western Pacific, and even further afield, extending down to Australia's northern approaches in the case of littoral Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, the PLA can now hold at risk and impose great costs on allied forces that would seek access and influence in that part of the region in a military sense, to say nothing of the non-military space. That's the challenge. The challenge is also one on the United States side with regards to its own global responsibilities and capacity going forward. And again, a challenge that is recognized in the United States and which requires a collective effort to offset and build out when it comes to maintaining a military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. So if that's the context, and that's the challenge, what's the opportunity? I would argue that the opportunity, particularly for the Australia-US alliance, is that the way that Canberra and Washington understand this problem set and the alignment of interests, although there are key differences, but the broad alignment of strategic interests that we have when it comes to maintaining a favorable balance of power and maintaining an open, inclusive and sovereign regional strategic order in which all states can go about their business without being coerced militarily or otherwise, provides the most powerful argument at a political and policy level for updating the mechanisms, updating the structures of the US-Australia alliance for a new set of major power challenges into the future. And that might sound strange. The reason that I see this as being an opportunity is that it's something that's been quite surprisingly missing from the US-Australia alliance since 1951. ANZUS, as the alliance is formerly known, is very different to US alliances in Europe, and is certainly very different to the US, Japan, and US ROK alliances, insofar as it has almost no, no formal institutional structures, no formal planning mechanisms to guide its activities or to guide its strategic thinking and strategic policy making. This sets it apart from many others in the region. And although that hasn't mattered for the US-Australia relationship for the last 70 years, and indeed, although we have seen incredibly strong cooperation at a military-to-military level between Australia and the United States in a whole range of global operations, what we have not seen is a way of building that out into an alliance that is focused and effective from a deterrent standpoint in the region that is of most core interest to the US and Australia, and that's the Indo-Pacific. So the opportunity building on this challenge is that we now have a space for conversations and recognition of a shared problem to turn the alliance into something that it hasn't previously been. So I want to spend the remaining time making 2 points really. One is about the need and the difficulty of updating the alliance for this era of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific that requires a collective defense response. And secondly, I'd like to provide one example of where I think we can begin to build that out in the region. So despite our very close defense ties and high level of interoperability, as I mentioned just before, what we don't have in the US-Australia alliance is a clear set of planning mechanisms from a military planning standpoint. We don't have a clear set of strategic policy coordination mechanisms when it comes to scenario planning and contingency planning. And we don't have any formal mechanisms for aligning or proposing roles and responsibilities between our respective militaries when it comes to peacetime deterrence operations or conflict. There are some historic and enduring service level mechanisms for coordinating or informing each other of maritime coordination in the region that theoretically still exist, but they have long since fallen by the wayside in any practical policy sense and are sorely in need of updating. These are the things that are the gold standards of alliance and alliance deterrence functionality, because these are the mechanisms and measures that build credibility, that build resolve, that build commitment, and that can set red lines when it comes to a crisis. But of course, none of these things is straightforward. For very good reasons, Canberra and Washington, despite their overlapping visions for the Indo-Pacific, have hesitations when it comes to formalizing the way that we will respond in any particular conflict and crisis. Part of that is because there are proximate divergences in priorities, not interests, but in priorities, which is to say that for Australia, as the 2020 Defence Strategic Update made abundantly clear, our priority region is the immediate part of the Indo-Pacific, stretching from the southwestern portion of the Indian Ocean through maritime Southeast Asia, PNG, and onwards to the South Pacific. Whereas for the United States, we understand that, of course, it's the first island chain and flashpoints in the Japanese archipelago, in Taiwan, and downwards to the South China Sea that occupies the minds of US strategic policy thinkers. Both countries care about each other's interests, but they weight these differently. And of course, when you're looking particularly at a military of the size of Australia's, which is small, albeit highly sophisticated and advanced in terms of its capabilities, bandwidth is a key consideration. And so we do need to, and we do want to prioritize and think about our alliance investments differently. And that's why we must update the alliance's capacity to actually have that conversation in a focused and coordinated way, in where we can as much identify the divergences in addressing our expectations of each other in a crisis, and appropriate ways of responding and assisting each other and third parties like Japan in the region, as we also are attendant to the proximate interests and the way that we need to deal with particular crises individually. So how might we begin this process of alliance transformation? I'd suggest here that one way we could think about this going forward would be to focus on transforming high-end exercises to the delivery of high-end effects. And that's a bit of a mindset shift. For a long time, US and Australia, working often with other close and trusted military partners in the region, including Japan, South Korea, and India, have developed anti-submarine warfare, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and maritime domain awareness capabilities. I want to focus here on anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which have been really in recent years emphasized when it comes to military exercises and training exercises amongst multiple countries, including the US and Australia. This, though, has been not advanced beyond the stage of exercises to transform to peacetime deterrence operations, peacetime anti-submarine warfare operations, or maritime domain awareness operations of the kind that existed during the Cold War in a collective or federated way between the US and Japan, or the US and NATO partners in Europe. And these are also the sorts of operations or peacetime deterrence missions that can take place without a formal institutionalized mechanism, where we're looking here rather at a way of operationalizing the alliance than formalizing rather the alliance. We've done this in the Middle East. The way that the US and Australia operated together in the Middle East, with Australian air platforms fully integrated into the US kill chain with regards to providing battlefield awareness and ISR to US shooters in the field, has been first class. That's been very much a plug and play approach to the way Australia has had an integrated role in the broader US joint force in the Middle East. And that's something which I think, by adopting the mindset of transitioning high-end exercises to high-end effects and rebadging and rethinking about things as deterrence operations rather than exercises that may signal deterrence, we can start to transition here in the Indo-Pacific as well. Of course, the functional and geographical division of labour when it comes to these things is a very sensitive topic. Countries do all want to preserve their own national capacities to undertake ISI, DA, ASW independently. And of course, that's a consideration for Australia, Japan, India, and other US regional partners. But that does not have to come at the expense of also building this out in a federated way with all of the attendant access and operational advantages that the locations across the bilateral, the trilateral, the quadrilateral could open up for Australia. So I'll leave that there as food for thought, and I very much look forward to a discussion where we can dig into some of these issues deeper.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to Madison as well for insightful comments. I think this sets the stage very well for a good discussion. So the instruction for Q&A should be flashed on your screen very soon, and I think they were there before. To ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function, which is located in the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please wait to be called and unmuted by Pacific Forum staff before speaking. And also, please state your name, position, and affiliation before speaking. Alternatively, you can post your question or comment in the Q&A tab, and I already see a few of them there. I'll do my best to read them out to the speakers and to everyone. Now, before I open up the floor to sort of jumpstart the conversation, let me ask a question to each of you. Ashley, why don't I start with you first? This is really, I think this will help set up the conversation. It's a really broad question about deterrence. You know, we talk about strengthening deterrence, and we usually talk about it in the context of a discussion about the change and changing balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, we do that with China in mind in the context of its re-rise. But specifically, what do you think we are trying to deter? And what I'm really asking here is about goals. You talked about goals or the ends of deterrence more so than the ways and means of deterrence. Are we trying to deny a sphere of influence, or are we trying to regain the initiative and, as you said, try to establish a more favorable balance of power? So that'll be my question to you. Let me pile on a question to Madison as well, which is more focused on the nuclear question. Madison, I guess, now that we've extended the US-Russia New START agreement, what is the way forward for arms control? You talked about some of the things that the United States could do vis-a-vis China, but what do you think is likely to happen? How do we actually get China involved? In what format? And frankly, how do you incentivize or pressure Beijing to get to yes on arms control? Because as you know, so far we haven't been successful. I think I heard you say essentially focus on risk reduction and crisis management more so than arms control. But if you could flesh that out a little bit, that would be great. So because you went first, Madison, why don't I go to Ashley for a response to my first question, and then we'll get back to you. Ashley.
Thanks, David. Look, I think that's a great question, and the specificity of what we are trying to deter outside of a handful of flashpoints that are well known and well trodden by analysts, such as Taiwan, for example, or the Scarborough Shoal, I think is often obscured and requires a degree of creativity to think about. So let me give you a couple of takes at that response of those issues that often don't get looked at as much. I think from Australia's perspective, when it comes to thinking about deterrence, it's true to say that Australia thinks primarily in terms of deterrence by denial. I would argue it's fair to say that that is also true of the United States, particularly with regard to the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and particularly with regard to the work through the Pentagon and Indo-Pacific that followed on from that strategy with regards to thinking about the first island chain. But I'll focus here on Australia. For Australia, what it is that we in our immediate region most importantly want to prevent is to prevent a closed environment, an environment in which state sovereignty becomes jeopardized, an environment in which freedom of movement, freedom of navigation for military and non-military purposes becomes difficult or closed, an environment where states are coerced. That is what we are trying to prevent. Another way of putting that would be a Chinese sphere of influence. Another way of putting that would be the encroachment of a Chinese zone of anti-access area denial further southwards. But we want to do that in a way, and Australia is looking to do that in a way that is in close partnership with the region. So for Australia, the best form of defence is actually shaping the regional strategic environment in the whole of government space. What it is in Southeast Asia and the Pacific that we are trying to prevent is quite different from what it is in the first island chain in Taiwan Strait, where there are certainly risks. I'll leave it to others to determine the probability of those risks, but there are risks of limited war scenarios or larger full-scale military operations by China to reclaim territories, to reclaim Taiwan in Northeast Asia. When we are not faced with that kind of situation by and large when it comes to Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we are faced with an environment where China may seek to install, through a range of grey zone, sub-conventional, conventional, and whole of government ways, may seek to install strategic presence of a kind that would compromise our security interests and those of our regional partners, which are in openness and sovereignty, in transparency and freedom of movement. So Australia's, I think, primary tool when it comes to thinking about deterrence by denial, is thinking about the way that we work with our regional partners to bolster their resilience, to bolster the resilience of their governments and governance institutions, to bolster the capacity and therefore the resilience of their coast guards, of their militaries, of their navies, the capacity for them to know, to see, to be able to respond to what's going on in their exclusive economic zones, in the territorial waters, to bolster the rule of law, and certainly to bolster the way that countries in the region pursue critical technologies and critical infrastructure from trusted vendors, so that there is no capacity, or there is limited capacity for covert external influence of a kind that we've seen efforts to build by China and parts of the region in their own societies. And fundamentally, by working with the region to establish Australia and also in partnership with Japan and the United States as regional partners of choice. We have an alignment of interest, not just with each other as allies or close partners in the case of Australia and Japan. We have an alignment of interests in an open regional security order with the vast majority of states in our immediate region, and indeed across the broader Indo-Pacific. And it's by investing in that, and it's by working in close partnership with those countries to advance our own good offices and our own investments in their and our joint regional security, that we get back to deterrence. Because it is simply the case that if countries in the region are themselves empowered to defend and uphold their own sovereign interests and are assisted by us where necessary or where we're asked to support that agenda, then it will be that much more difficult for China or any other potential external great power with hostile intentions to muscle into the region in any way other than it'll be very difficult for them to build influence in the region in clandestine manner. It'll be very difficult for them to gain a foothold in the region in a clandestine or overt manner, and they will indeed obviously find their strategic interests, if indeed they are seeking to build those out in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, more difficult to achieve. And that is, I think, ultimately what we are trying to fashion here.
Thank you, Ashley. Madison, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. What is the way forward for arms control, and how exactly can we incentivize China? So I would say that I think that there's a need, first and foremost, for the US and China to talk about intent before we talk about capabilities. And for that reason, I think that it would behoove the US to pursue a strategic dialogue with China. I know we've done this before, but I think that we probably need to do it again, maybe with a different tack. I actually think that this is something that we could also do with Russia as well, in terms of thinking about what comes next after New START. So I see some potential for applying this to China as well. And that I think we really need to, if we're going to engage in a strategic dialogue, we need to do so with a clear vision of how we want to try to maybe enhance transparency between the two countries, or create some strategic predictability. And I think the key thing to do there would be to start addressing some of those potential misperceptions that I highlighted earlier in my opening remarks, and having a frank conversation about, how the U.S. views China's behavior, even though, no, you are not necessarily, maybe in this instance, you haven't been saber rattling with your nuclear capability, but you know what, like, there's still these other things that you're doing or exercising that really make us think that the risk of nuclear use is going up. And so I think we need to be able to try to address those misperceptions and explain what explain what the U.S. perceptions are of these things, and how we see those as being a danger to the United States and our allies' security. And then allow China to clarify that, right? Allow them to clarify their strategy and intent if they're willing to do so. After that, I think maybe you could get into more discussions about weapons, or specific capabilities, or maybe doing some exhibitions of certain weapons or things like that. Although I think there's a lot of work to do before we'd ever get to that point. But I think that really having a dialogue about intent before capabilities is critical. And then I mentioned nuclear risk reduction versus arms control because, I mean, experience that we've had, the US has had in the past, particularly when things have not always been the best with formerly the Soviet Union and now Russia, is that despite tensions, we're still usually willing to cooperate when we find areas of interest where our interests could align in terms of our security and safety. And so, you know, have maybe approaching China of what happens if there's, you know, nuclear use on the Korean Peninsula? How do we, you know, maybe we need to talk about how we as two superpowers are going to respond to that, what we could do to mitigate any sort of damage, those kind of things. You know, things like the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. China was in that at one point as an observer. I think it would be a really good idea for them to potentially come back. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with that initiative, you know, essentially it's a multilateral, multi-government initiative looking at developing arms control solutions for full nuclear warhead dismantlement. And I think, you know, it's a totally optional dialogue, an optional partnership, one that is right now theoretical and is just developing a framework and a baseline. And but it's something that, you know, it's a good opportunity to help China see this is what transparency can bring you and what kind of stability benefits that a lot of countries feel, not just the ones that are directly involved in the arms control initiative, but their allies and their partners and their neighboring countries. So I think nuclear risk reduction is maybe another area that, if in addition to the strategic dialogue, where we can maybe try to crack the door open a little bit to have some more discussions. And it might be something that that would be easier to find some common ground on, right? If we're still getting too much reticence. In terms of how to incentivize China, I mean, that's the most difficult part, right? I think that there is maybe two things for me come to mind. I mean, the deterrence piece is definitely one of them in terms of communicating through signaling and through deterrence operations, you know, what U.S. objectives are, what U.S. ally intent is, and making it clear what we will and will not accept from China, what we see as risky, is one thing. So we need to bolster deterrence and bolster our security. At the same time, I think that there could be some opportunity for the U.S. to maybe, with the help of its allies and partners and others inside the international system, to help maybe pressure China from the outside. And I don't mean necessarily taking the approach of having Russia try to bring China to the table like the previous administration did. We saw how that went. That didn't really work, I think, the way that they hoped. But I mean, I do think China has shown it has previously responded to pressure from the international system when it gets told it's being a bad actor and a malign actor, and it's at risk of its reputation going south. And so maybe some creative campaigning among, you know, the US's allies and partners and friends around the globe to try to pressure China to start taking some serious steps in terms of actually having some meaningful engagement in this area would be a good way to do that, while we also, I think simultaneously, we have to have the other side. You have to have kind of the deterrence operations as well. We need to raise some risk in China's mind in order to get, I think, an effective response. But of course, that's not the only thing. I think the other thing it could help is probably posing some risks to their reputation too. So those are just my immediate thoughts and reactions.
Thank you, Madison. Let me move on to the questions from the floor. Let me take one from the raise hand function. I have Charles Morrison. If you should be unmuted very shortly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Charles Morrison, adjunct at the East-West Center in Honolulu. And I have, sorry if these are ignorant questions, but I have one of both speakers. And Madison, I think the interesting thing about the the US and Russian nuclear forces during the Cold War was that we built up thousands of nuclear warheads each and then moved back to the present level. But China had a completely different strategy, which was to build up to several hundred as best we know, and then basically capped it there and invested in economic stuff, invested in conventional forces and so forth. So there's kind of quite a bit of asymmetry in our nuclear forces. And I just wonder what the implications of that are for the kind of dialogue we'd have on nuclear issues, and whether the right partners are really the allies or whether there are other nuclear powers. What would be the best way to move forward? And Ashley almost answered the question I had when I first raised my hand. But I, like him, I sort of feel that our threat from our challenge for China is both a deterrence in the military sense, but especially a deterrence in the influence and economic sense. And so it is a whole of government approach. And I think that makes it a little different from the Middle East. Middle East, there's a very understood threat in, say, Afghanistan, but it's a little different in Southeast Asia, where it's a multi-dimensional challenge, and we're not quite sure how we should respond with what mix of government approaches. So I guess my question there is, how do we bring that whole of government approach in the deterrent military department part into that whole of government approach? And secondly, isn't there a part of the response is not just to defend against, but also to reinforce our own influence in the region, which is very considerable, especially in the cultural, education, and economic investment dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take a couple more questions. And in fact, let me take one from the chat rooms that is a good segue with what the previous question was about. And that's related to China's economic actions vis-a-vis Australia, and how Australia has responded to those moves, or is responding for that matter to those moves. So I guess here, Ashley, that would be essentially, what is it that Australia has done to China's gray zone operations, and how has Australia approached or counter those actions by China specifically? And this is a question from Richard Mackey. Let me take another one from the raise hand function, and this is from Rose Tenyutkin. If we can please unmute her.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Ashley and Madison, for these great comments. It's really wonderful to have this forum where we can bring voices from all over, the US, Australia, Honolulu, all over in different time zones, kind of to discuss these really important matters. I have a question for Madison and a question for Ashley. I'll start with the question for Ashley because it actually ties on to the question you just read. It's very similar. My question was kind of related to, regarding the whole of government approach Australia is taking to deter China. One thing you had mentioned just very quickly was, trying to work on protecting the critical technology, for instance. And so I'm kind of curious if you could expand on that comment, because I know that Australia has recently undergone some review of their foreign investments and kind of how they're going to determine what reaches a national security threshold, because I feel like this economic front is going to become an area of increasing concern for China, because they're able to pull those economic levers to really they're able to obtain foreign technologies for military purposes. And there's a whole lot we've seen with them in economic statecraft, and how the US now is trying to combat that. Australia is trying to combat that. If you could speak a little to what is Australia doing? I know very well like what the US side is doing with reforms to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and with our export control reforms. So what is currently Australia trying to do to counter China's foreign direct investment and kind of access to critical technologies? Kind of going into that again, kind of a gray zone, whole of government look at countering China. Then for Madison, my question is more about the US. So I was kind of curious about the US is kind of facing 3 competing nuclear policy priorities. It's pursuing this large, unprecedented modernization plan. It's repairing this myriad of fractured alliances with allies and partners who kind of had very mixed feelings after the last administration. Some of them mixed feelings on everything, including how they feel about nuclear weapons. And this administration is now saying, you know, we're committed to arms control. We're going to rebuild. We're pursuing arms control. But I feel like all 3 of these are going to be really hard to tackle and succeed in. So how do you think the Biden administration or the US should kind of balance these 3 competing priorities?
Great question. Thank you very much. Ashley, do you want to go first? Let's go back to the presenters, and then I'll take more questions. But Ashley,
sure. Thanks, David. And thanks, Charles, Richard, and Rose for those great questions. They are all variations on a theme. Look, let me say 2 things. One in terms of the Australia-China relationship, and then one in terms of, you know, where defence sort of sits in the multi-dimensional whole of government response. In terms of the Australia-China relationship, I think probably all listeners and viewers will be aware that the relationship at a bilateral level has been deteriorating for some time, but over the last 12 months has very significantly accelerated in its decline, precipitated by China's response to Australian foreign ministers' a call for an international inquiry into the origin and spread of COVID-19, which was ultimately voted on by over 100 countries at the World Health Assembly, including China itself. Nonetheless, for the Australia-China relationship, you could say that was, from Beijing's standpoint, the straw that broke the camel's back, insofar as Australia standing up for its interests, standing up for the interests that we have in a liberal international order, and taking concrete and costly steps to ensure that we are doing our part to upholding that order in a both defence and non-defence sense. China responded by imposing sequentially a whole range of sanctions, tariff measures, and other forms of economic punishment on Australian industries, touching 14 industries, I believe, is where we are at the moment in the tally. Those industries collectively accounting for around $150 billion in the Australia-China bilateral trade relationship, although not in terms of actual appreciated cost. Because, of course, at the same time, the Australia-China broader economic relationship has still increased over the past 12 months. So it's very hard to assess the actual economic fallout of this. But I think what is important is to note, why this has happened. And David, to your question about Australia's response to China in the grey zone, I'm not particularly comfortable with that term for what I'm about to say, but Australia's response to a range of Chinese efforts to influence in a clandestine or in an open but unacceptable way the Australian public or Australia over the past few years have been responded to by a range of measures. What the Australian government has done has, in no particular order, has been to take Huawei and ZTE out of Australia's 5G network, or to prohibit them from entering in a world-leading decision there in 2017. Australia has, as one of the questions implied, imposed new measures to assess foreign investment in Australia broadly, but in critical infrastructure in particular, through strengthening of the Foreign Interference Transparency Scheme, or through its establishment. We have taken measures to root out clandestine foreign political influence within our university sector, within our public sector, within business in Australia. More recently, Australia has taken up measures to review through the Foreign Minister's Office, investment by China, in particular in the research and university sector, again, looking for where there are not illegal, but strategically undesirable and hitherto needing to pass the national interest test efforts by China to gain access to Australian intellectual property, Australian know-how, Australian potentially useful strategic technology at the pointing end of the spectrum. So the Australian government has taken a range of those sorts of defensive measures. In addition to that, we've taken strong positions in Australia when it comes to the South China Sea, when it comes to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, when it comes to the South China Sea. I'll draw your attention to Australia, like the United States, supporting publicly the ruling of the 2016 PCA again last year, and and specifically deeming Chinese actions since that ruling as illegal, in support of a range of letters by Southeast Asian countries to the United Nations, protesting that earlier last year and late the year before. So Australia has taken a range of what we might call activist measures in defence of sovereignty and measures in defence of regional interests that have been the reason why this marked deterioration in Australia-China relations has happened, and which is also why the economic coercion that China has lumped on Australia in the last 12 months has accelerated. Just moving from that to the second piece with regards to the multidimensional response that we need to undertake in the region. I think, Charles, your question in particular, where does defence sit on this? I would just make the following point, which is that, one of the things Australia has tried to do in recent years, and certainly through the Defence Strategic Update is signalling its intention to do a lot more of into the future, is taking, as best we can with the institutional measures that we have at our disposal, the whole of government approach to resolving or to investing in the region's resilience, to investing in our regional partners. The Australian effort called the Pacific Step Up to bolster the resilience and sort of national equities really of Pacific Island countries across every domain that you can think of, from health to education to development to political institutions to coast guards and patrol boats. That has been a truly joint effort that cuts across multiple departments in the Australian government, is led by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and which probably you could say sort of the gold standard for an integrated whole of government intervention into building the kind of regional order that we want in collaboration with regional partners in ways that cut across bureaucratic silos. There is a very, very prominent defence piece, although it's led by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The defence piece has seen an increase in an Australian uniformed presence right across the Pacific, has seen an increase in our investment in providing patrol boats to Pacific Island countries, but also training them, has seen Australia stand up things like the Pacific Fusion Centre to provide intelligence, to provide open source intelligence and other forms of situational awareness to regional countries. So that sort of effort is I think, exactly the kind of effort that we need to broaden out when it comes to other parts of the region. The Pacific is a very, very big region. It's very, so I'm not trying to say that the problem is easier to solve there, because it's such a broad region. It does pose challenges of its own, but compared to such a politically complex environment like Southeast Asia, it's going to be more difficult for us to graft that approach to Southeast Asia. Australia is endeavouring to supplement its military, again through defence presence exercises, arrangements, access agreements and so forth, its military engagement in Southeast Asia, with an increase announced late last year in our investment through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in a range of initiatives in Southeast Asia. But that's, I think, where we start to get to conversations about the US-Australia alliance, the trilateral with Japan, the role of India and others in doing this in a more, let's say, coordinated way, where we are not working at cross purposes and where we are finding, again, not just the whole of government, but the whole of network approach to building that resilience in, like I say, a much more complex part of the region.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Madison?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate both of these questions because they're just very thoughtful. So on the first one, thinking about comparative scenarios where we had the U.S. versus the Soviet Union and Russia and that arms control relationship and that buildup that kind of became necessary or became a key bargaining chip to getting both sides to the table versus the U.S. and China nuclear buildup. I guess I will say I don't think we're heading for an arms race in the same way as we saw back in the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time. And so therefore, in some ways we have to get more creative, right? In terms of how we develop that incentive for there to be dialogue and so I think that there needs to be a lot of flexibility on how we approach this in terms of thinking about what we're willing to talk about and really thinking about the threats in kind of a networked way and a whole spectrum of conflict sort of way, because for one thing, the threat environment is changing, that I think it demands as such. And then for another, it's not the same experience. And so not everything's going to translate evenly. And then I don't think we want some things to translate evenly across how things were in the Cold War with the arms race buildup between the US and the Soviet Union and the US and China right now. And then in terms of whether or not, should it be other nuclear powers that help place pressure on China, or should it be, allies and partners or other players in the international system? My immediate instinct is, I think it should be both. But then also at the same time, I will acknowledge that I think that there has been some effort by other nuclear powers to kind of say, China, it'd be good if you'd come into the fold here. And China's like, no, we're still lower than all of you guys, and you still have all these other issues that you need to work out. So I'm not sure. I think that having outward pressure from other players and actors in the international system could stand to be more effective in the long run. But that being said, I think it could be effective if it comes from all sides as well. And then to Rose's question, so I really like this question because you're absolutely right. The United States is facing a lot of it. These are all very seemingly different in competing priorities, but though they are competing, I would not say that they're mutually exclusive. And in a lot of ways, I actually think some of them could be reinforcing of each other. In particular, I think in terms of repairing alliances, I think the United States modernizing its deterrent actually goes a long way to potentially bolstering those assurance relationships. So I honestly believe that if you can't be against US, I think it's hard to be against US modernization and pro allies at the same time, if you're really thinking about the holistic picture. And so I think that it's going to be, if we want to pursue a renewal of US alliances, I think it's going to be important that we remain committed to modernization. And for arms control and having a commitment to arms control, this is a little bit tougher. Again, I don't necessarily see, I understand some people see US modernization as being equivocal to US buildup. And I think that's a little bit of a false reality. That's just my personal opinion. I don't think that you have, that again, they're mutually exclusive. And so I think it's possible that we can still pursue arms control relationships while doing all these things. But one thing that's going to be really key to building some effective arms control relationships and maintaining those alliances is in making sure that we are involving our partners and allies throughout all those conversations that we're having. I don't necessarily think that means automatically everything needs to be multilateralized, but I think we need to make sure that we consult with allies I know the U.S. did this, I think, quite a bit in the Obama administration, and so I would expect that the Biden administration would probably continue with that practice. But that's kind of how I think we could manage to achieve a balance of all of them, is just by recognizing that in many ways they're actually mutually reinforcing, and they really need to be treated as such.
Thank you, Madison. So we have time for just a few questions. I'll ask, let me read 2 questions off the chat rooms and then call on one person who's raised his hand. I'll ask for very quick answers. They're very difficult questions that would require a lot more than just a few minutes, but I'll just ask them anyway. The first one is from Charlie Brown. And I guess this is a question directed more to Ashley. And the question is, what can we expect in the next OSMIN, particularly from the new administration, to enhance the alliance? And what specifically would you recommend be included that has not yet been articulated before? And so I guess, an Australian perspective on that specific question. Another question has to do with Taiwan and the risk that we could get into a conflict over Taiwan, a military conflict over Taiwan, and what the alliance should do with that prospect. What is it that we're not doing that we could do to prepare, I guess, for a potential conflict with Taiwan? This is actually from an anonymous attendee. And then finally, let me give the floor to Richard Mackey, if we can please unmute him. And again, I'll ask to be, please, very, very concise, because we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately.
I will. First off, I want to say you two are way too young to be so smart, so we'll leave it at that. South China Sea and freedom of navigation operations, initiated by the Americans, joined fairly early on by Australia. Now we have England and France coming into it. But the most concerned countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, are not involved in this. What needs to be done?
Again, very easy question to answer in a few minutes. Thank you so much. We will literally just have a few minutes, so please keep your answers short. And I see a lot of interest, so this is a good sign that this process is popular and that we'll need to do a lot more of it. So please, with that, Madison, why don't I go to you first?
Sure. So I guess I'll try to tackle the Taiwan question. How can the U.S. and allies prepare for a potential conflict over Taiwan? I mean, I think that there's probably 2 different levels of answers of analysis for answers to this question. One being kind of at the strategic level of, having, as Ashley had suggested earlier, really maybe thinking through the strategic and policy planning side of this, and thinking about, okay, if this is a contingency and this happens, what are our objectives going to be? What are the U.S. objectives going to be? What are our shared objectives? And then, maybe from there you can get down to more of the operational planning side of things that might include involvement in tabletop exercises, as well as actual live exercises, wargaming, that kind of stuff, to maybe help you then figure out where would the roles and responsibilities lie? Where could Australia potentially contribute to any sort of U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, and vice versa? How could the U.S. also, commit itself to helping defend Australian interests in this scenario? So that's a very short and brief answer to a series of good closing questions, but that's my immediate thoughts in terms of, I think it comes to having a dialogue about really what the expectations are, what the desired end states are, and then actually making some attempts to practice and exercise those together.
Thank you, Madison. Thank you for being concise. Ashley?
I will try my best to be as equally concise. To the question on OSMIN, look, what to watch for, I think, would be progress on the national technology and industrial base. We've seen that's an agreement that Australia was brought into several years ago during the twilight of the Obama administration, along with the UK and Canada. Essentially, it's about creating a defence industry free trade zone between our four countries, four of the five Eyes countries. It has not proven particularly successful to date insofar as progress has been slow in finding ways to break down ITAR restrictions, export controls and such on the US side of the ledger to provide the setting in which technologies, IP and so forth can be brought into the US system that is developed outside of the US system in places like Australia. That's a challenge, it's an ongoing one. It's been approached with some success through pilot programs around particular initiatives. At the moment, we're looking at co-development or hopefully co-development of hypersonics. I think at the higher end of ambition, we'd like to see the US invest through something like the NTIB with Australia in domestic production of munitions here in Australia, which would solve a range of problems for the alliance as well as the US sort of sustainment and pre-position materials in the region. That's one. In terms of Taiwan, look, I think this is an issue which deserves more than 30 seconds. Suffice to say that I think thinking about the geographic division of labour when it comes to Australia, the US and Japan is where this conversation could begin. As I think I illustrated a bit earlier on in the piece, Australia's focus is closer to Australia. It extends further north than it has previously. It doesn't extend all the way to Taiwan as a core military interest for Australia, even as Australia's relationship with Taiwan and with the United States on that question is evolving and was actually discussed publicly in the readout from OSMIN last year. So I think the broader issue is thinking about which allies have what equities in what flashpoints and thinking about how where allies are not having a frontline role, they have other roles to play, again, in terms of sustainment, in terms of logistics, supply, and all of those issues that are critical, but also in terms of managing horizontal escalation in other parts of the region, if indeed there was a crisis. And then finally, on the issue of FONOPS on ASEAN, just a point here, Australia has not undertaken any freedom of navigation operations. It's not something the Australian Navy has ever done. The only Navy that does that in the region is the United States. Having said that, Australia does exercise and has done since the 70s, a routine aerial surface presence in the South China Sea. It continues to do so. Of course, the role of ASEAN is important. I think the moniker here is that we can't want it more than they do. And therefore, we need to find ways to undertake maritime exercises, maritime presence and patrols wherever possible with regional partners. Some good suggestions from folks in the Biden administration include broadening out the role of the US Coast Guard to find ways of undertaking joint patrols with regional constabulary forces. It might be the Australian Border Force and third countries in the region rather than necessarily relying just on navies. There are a whole range of ways to get at that problem, but I think it is one that is probably likely to happen in groups of two in the first instance. That is to say, where Australia and Indonesia might work towards a joint exercise in part of the region that would signal a degree of shared concern about a particular problem, rather than it being an alliance plus ASEAN country X in the first instance.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you to Madison as well for great remarks. I'm sorry, we've got to stop the discussion here. This has been very rich. I haven't gotten to all the questions, but that's what happens when we have a popular webinar. So again, thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you to everyone for joining the conversation. Please stay tuned for the third session of our US, Australia, Indo-Pacific conversation series. The next one will take place at some point in April. And the next session will focus on the United States and Australia, how they are partnering with Pacific Islands nations. So please stay tuned for that. Again, thank you very much to both of our speakers and to everyone, and we hope to see you soon again. Thank you. Aloha.
Thanks, David.